The day people stop seeing your uniform is the day they finally hear your voice. I didn't believe those words when my grandmother whispered them to me years ago. At 24, wearing a gray housekeeping uniform instead of the business suit I'd once dreamed about in college brochures, I thought uniforms were invisible walls that kept people exactly where the world expected them to stay. Every morning before sunrise, I pushed my cleaning cart through the polished marble corridors of the Sterling Grand Hotel, one of the most prestigious properties in Manhattan, where billion-dollar deals were signed over imported coffee while I quietly polished brass railings that reflected other people's success. The scent of fresh lemon polish mixed with roasted espresso drifted through the lobby as executives hurried past me without ever making eye contact. They remembered the hotel's crystal chandeliers, the Italian marble, and the breathtaking skyline outside the windows. They never remembered the maid who made everything sparkle before they arrived. That Tuesday began like every other. I clocked in at 6:30, tied my blonde hair into a neat bun, straightened my name tag that read Grace Bennett, and reminded myself that every shift brought me one paycheck closer to paying off the community college debt I still carried after leaving school to care for my sick grandmother. Life hadn't turned out the way either of us imagined, but Grandma always smiled whenever I came home wearing that simple gray uniform. "Honest work is still honorable work," she'd tell me. Those words stayed with me as I loaded fresh towels onto my cart and headed toward the executive floors where every hallway felt quieter than a church sanctuary. Thick carpet softened every footstep, expensive artwork lined the walls, and floor-to-ceiling windows painted Manhattan in pale shades of gold as the sun climbed over the skyline. By 8:15, my supervisor rushed toward me, breathing harder than I'd ever seen. "Grace, I need a favor." Before I could answer, she placed a silver tray into my hands. On it sat a porcelain coffee service, 12 cups, fresh pastries, and neatly folded linen napkins. "Room Executive 1." Their assistant never showed up. "Just deliver this and leave immediately. Don't say anything unless someone speaks to you." I nodded because saying no had never been a luxury I could afford. The tray felt heavier than it looked as I stepped toward the private executive corridor, a section of the hotel I had never entered before. The doors there were darker wood, the lighting softer, the silence somehow louder. I found the double doors marked Executive Boardroom and carefully pushed one open with my shoulder. The conversation inside stopped so suddenly it felt as if the entire room had forgotten how to breathe. Around a long walnut table sat more power than I had ever seen gathered in one place. Men and women in tailored suits looked up from glowing presentation screens, their expressions shifting from concentration to confusion. At the far end of the table sat a man whose presence silenced everyone else without a single word. Nathaniel Sterling. Even before I recognized him from magazine covers, I knew he was the one in charge. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move. His calm blue eyes simply met mine across the room, and for one impossible second, the billionaire chairman and the hotel maid looked at each other as though neither of us belonged where we stood. My fingers tightened around the silver tray so hard I was afraid I might crack the porcelain. Every instinct told me to apologize and disappear before anyone asked why a housekeeper had wandered into the most important meeting in the building. I lowered my eyes. "I am sorry for interrupting. I was asked to deliver your coffee." My voice sounded much smaller than I intended. Before I could take another step, one of the board members sighed loudly enough for everyone to hear. Housekeeping cannot even follow basic instructions anymore. A few quiet chuckles circled the polished table. Another executive glanced at his watch before looking back at me with obvious annoyance. "Leave the tray and close the door behind you. We are discussing matters worth more than this entire hotel." Heat rushed into my face, but I kept my expression steady. Years of working around wealthy guests had taught me that embarrassment faded faster when you refused to feed it. I carefully walked along the side of the enormous walnut table, placing each coffee cup exactly where it belonged. The room smelled of dark roast coffee, leather portfolios, and expensive cologne. Large digital screens displayed financial charts filled with numbers I barely understood, yet I recognized one thing immediately. Every person in that room looked tense. Even the smiles felt rehearsed. As I reached the final place setting near the head of the table, I noticed a stack of presentation folders lying partially beneath one of the coffee saucers. The hot pot tilted slightly as I poured, and a single drop landed near the edge of the folder. I reacted without thinking. I quickly lifted the folder away before the coffee could spread across the printed pages. Careful, I whispered more to myself than anyone else. The movement drew immediate attention. Do not touch confidential documents, a senior director snapped, pushing back his chair. You people need to remember your place. The words echoed through the room with uncomfortable clarity. I froze. My heart pounded against my ribs, but I did not lower my head this time. I simply looked at the folder still dry in my hand before placing it gently back onto the table. I was trying to keep it clean, I said quietly. The director scoffed. You were trying to involve yourself in business that is far above your understanding. Silence settled again. I expected someone else to agree with him. Instead, I heard only the soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic 30 floors below. Then Nathaniel Sterling finally spoke. His voice was calm, almost effortless. She prevented damage to the report. No one answered. He did not raise his voice or defend me further. He simply stated a fact, and somehow that carried more weight than an argument ever could. The director forced a tight smile. Of course, Mr. Sterling. I simply meant that procedures exist for a reason. Nathaniel's blue eyes remained on the financial report for another moment before lifting toward me again. There was no pity in his expression. No amusement either. Only careful observation, as though he had noticed something the rest of the room had completely missed. I stepped backward, ready to leave at last, when one of the projection screens suddenly flickered. Several charts disappeared, replaced by a blank gray display. Frustrated voices immediately filled the room. Someone blamed the technology team. Another blamed the presentation software. As I reached the door, I glanced once toward the disconnected cable lying loosely beneath the conference table. It had slipped halfway out of its port, probably nudged by someone's polished shoe during the meeting. I hesitated, wondering whether saying anything would only invite another reminder that I did not belong there. My hand rested on the brass doorknob, but something inside me refused to leave. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was simple common sense. I looked back toward the conference table where frustrated voices were beginning to overlap. The gray screen reflected the worried faces of people who controlled companies, investments, and careers, yet none of them seemed to notice the black cable hanging loosely beneath the edge of the table. I swallowed carefully. Speaking again would probably earn me another reminder that I was only the maid. Staying silent felt dishonest. Excuse me, I said softly. No one listened. The discussion had already shifted toward missed deadlines and technical support. I cleared my throat. I think the cable came loose. Every head turned toward me again. The same director who had criticized me moments earlier frowned with open irritation. We do not need maintenance advice from housekeeping. A few people looked uncomfortable. Others simply avoided looking at me altogether. I felt my cheeks warm, but I pointed toward the floor anyway. I only noticed because I was standing by the screen. The information technology manager crouched beside the table, followed the cable with his eyes, and pushed it firmly back into place. A second later, every financial chart returned to the display. Colorful graphs stretched across the screen exactly as they had before. The room became unusually quiet. Nobody laughed this time. The director who had dismissed me adjusted his expensive tie before forcing a smile that never reached his eyes. Well, that was fortunate. Fortunate. Not thank you. Not well done. Just fortunate. I nodded once, accepting that some people protected their pride more carefully than the truth. I reached for the empty coffee pot, hoping I could finally disappear into the hallway where life made sense again. Then another voice interrupted. Wait. Nathaniel Sterling spoke without looking away from the presentation screen. The entire board immediately fell silent. He slowly closed the leather folder in front of him before lifting his eyes toward me. "What is your name?" My heart skipped. Nobody important had ever asked for my name before. Usually I was called housekeeping, miss, or simply her. "Grace," I answered. "Grace Bennett, sir." He held my gaze for another quiet moment. "Thank you, Miss Bennett." 2 simple words. They should not have mattered as much as they did. Yet hearing my own name spoken with respect inside that room felt strangely unfamiliar. I managed a small smile before turning toward the door again. As I stepped into the hallway, I finally released the breath I had been holding. The heavy doors closed behind me with a soft click, shutting away the voices of billion-dollar decisions. I leaned briefly against the cool wall, trying to steady my racing heartbeat. My shift still had 6 hours left. There were guest rooms waiting to be cleaned, beds to make, and floors to polish. I reminded myself that whatever had happened inside that boardroom would probably be forgotten before lunchtime. People like Nathaniel Sterling lived in a different universe. Our paths had crossed by accident and would never cross again. That was what I believed until my supervisor hurried toward me with a face paler than I had ever seen. "Grace," she whispered urgently, glancing over both shoulders. "Do not leave this floor." My stomach tightened. "Why?" She hesitated for a long second before answering. "The chairman's executive assistant just called. Mr. Sterling personally requested that you remain available. He wants to speak with you after the meeting ends." The hallway suddenly felt much smaller. I stared at the closed boardroom doors, wondering what possible reason the most powerful man in the company could have for asking to see a hotel maid a second time. The next 40 minutes crawled by slower than any shift I had ever worked. I polished brass elevator doors that already gleamed, folded towels that did not need folding again, and straightened decorative pillows with hands that refused to stop trembling. Every few minutes I caught myself looking toward the executive corridor, half expecting someone to appear and tell me there had been a mistake. My supervisor tried to reassure me, but the uncertainty in her own voice only made my imagination worse. Perhaps a guest had complained. Perhaps I had violated some company policy without realizing it. By the time the boardroom doors finally opened, my stomach felt too tight for lunch. Executives filtered into the hallway in small groups, continuing conversations about markets, acquisitions, and quarterly projections. Most of them walked past me without recognition, but a few remembered exactly who I was. The same director who had dismissed me inside the meeting slowed his pace just enough to glance at my uniform. "Still here?" he asked with a thin smile. "Interesting." Before I could answer, a woman wearing a navy business suit approached. She carried a digital tablet against her arm and moved with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to working beside powerful people. "Miss Bennett?" she asked. I nodded. "Mr. Sterling will see you now." My supervisor gave me an encouraging smile, although I could tell she was just as curious as I was. I followed the assistant through another hallway lined with framed photographs documenting decades of the company's history. Every image showed groundbreaking ceremonies, ribbon cuttings, charity events, and business milestones. In every picture, people wore elegant suits. None of them wore housekeeping uniforms. We stopped outside a private office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park. The assistant opened the door and stepped aside. "Please go in." My pulse echoed in my ears as I crossed the threshold. The office felt surprisingly quiet. Shelves filled with books covered one wall while sunlight stretched across polished hardwood floors. Nathaniel Sterling stood beside the windows, his suit jacket resting neatly over the back of a chair. He looked less intimidating without the board seated around him, but somehow even more composed. He turned as I entered. "Thank you for waiting, Miss Bennett." "Of course, sir." I kept both hands folded in front of me, careful not to touch anything. "Please sit." I looked toward the leather chair, then back at him, convinced I had misunderstood. "I am fine standing." A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. That was not a test. It was an invitation. Slowly, I sat down, feeling strangely out of place in furniture that probably cost more than my car. Nathaniel remained standing for another moment before taking the chair across from me instead of behind the enormous desk. The choice surprised me. It made the conversation feel less like an interrogation and more like two people simply talking. "How long have you worked here?" he asked. "Almost 3 years. And before that?" "Community college. I studied business administration until my grandmother became ill. I left school to work full-time." His expression changed almost imperceptibly. "Business administration." I nodded. "Only 2 years. I never finished." He rested his hands together thoughtfully. "Inside the boardroom, you noticed details that several experienced executives overlooked. The report. The cable. You remained calm even after being spoken to unfairly." I looked down for a moment before answering. "I only paid attention, sir. That is part of my job. If I stop noticing small things, rooms stop looking their best." Silence settled between us, comfortable rather than awkward. Nathaniel studied me with the same careful attention he had shown during the meeting. Finally he spoke again, his voice lower than before. "Sometimes the people who notice the smallest details are the only ones capable of seeing the biggest problems. I think someone underestimated you long before this morning. I intend to find out who." For a moment I forgot that I was sitting across from one of the most influential men in New York. I only heard the last sentence repeating inside my mind. "Someone underestimated you." Nobody had ever said those words to me before. Most people assumed they already knew exactly who I was the moment they saw the housekeeping uniform. They never asked why I wore it or what dreams I had folded away with the rest of my old life. I looked up carefully. "Sir, I appreciate your kindness, but I think you are giving me too much credit." Nathaniel leaned back slightly, his expression calm. "No. I am giving you exactly the amount your actions earned." His answer caught me completely off guard. There was no flattery in his voice. It sounded like a conclusion he had reached after reviewing evidence. He reached for a thin folder resting on the table beside him. "Your employment record is impressive. Perfect attendance for nearly 3 years. Not a single complaint from guests. Multiple commendations from department managers. Every supervisor describes you the same way. Reliable. Observant. Honest." I blinked in surprise. I had no idea anyone had ever read those reports, much less the chairman himself. "I was only doing my job," I replied. "That is becoming a rare quality." He closed the folder and folded his hands together again. "Tell me something, Miss Bennet. Why did you leave business school?" I hesitated before answering. "My grandmother raised me after my parents passed away. When her health declined, tuition became impossible. Someone had to pay the bills. And she is better now?" A small smile appeared despite everything. "Much better. She still insists on baking apple pie every Sunday even though her doctor tells her to slow down." Nathaniel smiled faintly. It was brief, almost hidden, but genuine. "She sounds determined." "She is." Silence settled comfortably between us again. Through the windows, sunlight reflected off neighboring skyscrapers, filling the office with a warm glow that softened the sharp lines of the expensive furniture. Then Nathaniel stood and walked toward a cabinet where a crystal pitcher of water rested beside 2 glasses. He poured one for me before filling his own. The simple gesture surprised me more than anything else that morning. Men with his reputation usually expected service. They did not offer it. "There is something else," he said as he returned to his chair. "The director who spoke to you during the meeting has already recommended disciplinary action against you." My stomach tightened instantly. "For delivering coffee?" "Officially, for interrupting executive proceedings and handling confidential documents." I stared at the floor for a second before quietly shaking my head. "I never intended to cause trouble." "I know." His answer came immediately. "Then why would he?" I stopped myself. It was not my place to question company politics. Nathaniel finished the thought for me. Because admitting he was wrong would require more humility than some people possess. I let out a slow breath. If my presence created problems, I can apologize. He looked directly into my eyes. Would that apology be truthful? The question lingered between us. I searched for the safest answer, but none came. Finally, I spoke honestly. No, sir. I am sorry the meeting was interrupted. I am not sorry that I protected the report or pointed out the cable. Those were the right things to do. Nathaniel did not answer immediately. Instead, he nodded once, almost imperceptibly, as though confirming something only he understood. Then he opened a desk drawer and slid a plain white envelope across the polished wood toward me. This was suggested as a way to resolve today's misunderstanding. I looked down without touching it. Even before opening the envelope, I recognized the unmistakable shape of a check inside. I stared at the envelope without reaching for it. The room suddenly felt much quieter than before, so quiet that I could hear the faint ticking of the clock mounted above the bookshelf. My grandmother used to say that every important decision arrived dressed as an easy one. Looking at that envelope, I finally understood what she meant. It was not just paper resting on polished wood. It was a choice. Nathaniel watched me patiently, making no effort to push it closer. "You are not curious?" he asked. I looked back at him. "I think I already know what it is." "Then tell me." I drew a slow breath. "Enough money to make today disappear." His expression remained unreadable. "Open it." I gently picked up the envelope and unfolded the check inside. The number printed across the center was larger than I had earned in almost an entire year of working at the hotel. My fingers froze. That amount could erase my student loans, repair my grandmother's roof before winter, and replace my aging sedan that barely survived highway traffic every morning. For one brief moment, temptation whispered louder than reason. Then I folded the check and carefully slid it back into the envelope. I placed it exactly where it had been. Nathaniel did not move. "You did not even ask why it was offered." "Because it does not matter." He tilted his head slightly. "Explain." I met his eyes. "If it is a reward, it is too much for carrying coffee. If it is compensation for being insulted, respect cannot be purchased. If it is payment for staying quiet, I have nothing to stay quiet about because I did nothing wrong." The office remained completely silent. Outside the windows, helicopters drifted across the Manhattan skyline while tiny yellow taxis crawled through traffic dozens of stories below. Nathaniel rested one hand against the arm of his chair, studying me with the same calm attention that had unsettled me since the board meeting. Most people would have accepted it without hesitation. I smiled faintly. Most people probably have larger bank accounts than I do. That earned the smallest hint of laughter from him. It disappeared almost as quickly as it arrived. "Do you know who suggested this check?" I slowly shook my head. "The director who accused you this morning." His proposal was simple. Offer a generous settlement, avoid unnecessary attention, and allow everyone to move on. I lowered my eyes to the envelope again before gently pushing it back across the desk. "Then please return it to him." Nathaniel looked at the envelope but made no effort to pick it up. "Are you refusing because you dislike him?" "No." "Because you dislike me?" "No, sir." "Then why?" I answered before fear could stop me. "Because if I accept money for doing the right thing once, I will eventually convince myself there is a price for doing the right thing every time. I do not want to become that person." The words surprised even me. I had never planned to say them aloud. They simply arrived. Nathaniel's eyes remained fixed on mine for several long seconds before he finally reached for the envelope. Instead of placing it back into the drawer, he quietly tore the check into several neat pieces and dropped them into the wastebasket beside his desk. "Good," he said. "Now I know the reports were correct." I blinked. "What reports?" The ones that described your character instead of your position. Before I could respond, someone knocked softly on the office door. Nathaniel's assistant stepped inside with an uneasy expression. "Sir, the afternoon finance committee is waiting." Nathaniel acknowledged her with a nod but did not stand. "Please tell them I will be 5 minutes late." The assistant hesitated for only a fraction of a second before quietly leaving. As the door closed again, Nathaniel looked back at me with unexpected seriousness. "Miss Bennet, I believe this morning was not an accident. I think you walked into something much larger than either of us realized." The weight of his words stayed with me long after I left the executive office. Something much larger than either of us realized. I repeated the sentence silently as I pushed my housekeeping cart back through the familiar hallways. The polished floors looked exactly the same. Guests smiled politely as they walked past. Room service carts rolled across the thick carpet. Everything appeared perfectly ordinary, yet nothing felt ordinary anymore. By late afternoon I had almost convinced myself that Nathaniel had simply been cautious. Perhaps powerful people always expected hidden problems because they lived surrounded by them. I finished preparing an executive suite overlooking Central Park and was replacing fresh orchids on the dining table when raised voices drifted through the partially open connecting office next door. I had not realized anyone was using the adjoining conference room. The heavy wooden door between the rooms had not closed completely after a maintenance inspection earlier that morning. I froze for only a second before reminding myself that it was none of my business. I gathered my cleaning supplies and quietly continued dusting the bookshelves nearest the exit. Then one sentence stopped me completely. "The chairman cannot see the revised numbers until next week." Another man answered in a lower voice. "He will not. The original files are already gone. By the time anyone notices, the acquisition will be approved." My hand tightened around the feather duster. I was not trying to listen. Their voices simply carried through the narrow opening between the rooms. "And the hotel division?" the first man asked. "Sell it after the vote. It will never matter once the board signs everything." A chair scraped across the floor. Papers shuffled. Someone laughed quietly. "Sterling trusts the wrong people. He always believes honesty still exists." My pulse quickened. Without thinking, I stepped backward, accidentally brushing my housekeeping cart. One spray bottle tipped over, striking the lower shelf with a dull plastic thump. Silence followed instantly. Every sound in the neighboring room disappeared. My heartbeat seemed loud enough to fill both rooms. Footsteps approached the connecting door. I grabbed the spray bottle, straightened the towels stacked on my cart, and forced myself to keep breathing normally. The door opened just a few inches. A man in an expensive charcoal suit looked inside with narrowed eyes. I recognized him immediately. He was the same director who had mocked me during the morning board meeting. His gaze swept across the room before stopping on my housekeeping cart. "What are you doing in here?" he asked. "Cleaning the suite, sir." I kept my voice calm and lifted the fresh towels as if they had my full attention. He studied me for another long moment. "How long have you been here?" I answered honestly. "About 15 minutes. His expression revealed nothing, but something behind his eyes changed. He glanced once toward the open windows before looking back at me. "Did you hear anyone talking next door?" My grandmother always said that the truth did not require decoration. "I heard voices," I replied. "I was working." He smiled politely, although it felt colder than the marble floors downstairs. "Good. Continue working." He closed the connecting door with deliberate care and walked away. I waited until his footsteps disappeared before finally releasing the breath trapped in my lungs. My hands were shaking again. Maybe I had heard nothing important. Maybe business executives discussed confidential projects every day. Yet one sentence refused to leave my mind. "Sterling trusts the wrong people." As I pushed my cart into the hallway, I noticed a reflection in the polished brass elevator doors. At the far end of the corridor, Nathaniel Sterling's longtime assistant stood speaking quietly into her phone. Her eyes lifted unexpectedly and met mine. The concern on her face lasted only a heartbeat before she ended the call and started walking toward me much faster than before. The assistant stopped a few feet in front of me, lowering her voice before she spoke. "Miss Bennett, may I have a moment?" I nodded, still holding the handle of my housekeeping cart. Up close, I noticed how carefully she hid her concern behind professional composure. "My name is Evelyn Brooks," she said. "I have worked with Mr. Sterling for almost 12 years. She glanced briefly toward the executive corridor before looking back at me. "He asked me to make sure you finished your shift safely today." I blinked in confusion. Safely? The word sounded strangely out of place inside one of the most luxurious hotels in Manhattan. Evelyn chose her next sentence carefully. "There are people in this company who do not appreciate unexpected complications." I immediately thought about the conversation I had overheard and the director's unusually polite smile. Did something happen? She hesitated just long enough to tell me there had. "Nothing that should concern you yet. I only wanted you to know that if anyone asks unusual questions, you should contact me before answering." She slipped a simple white business card into my hand. It carried only her name, direct phone number, and the Sterling Holdings logo. There was no dramatic warning, no explanation, only quiet preparation. I thanked her and tucked the card into my uniform pocket just as my radio crackled with another housekeeping assignment. Room 3816 needed immediate service before an important guest arrived. I pushed my cart toward the elevators, determined to finish the day and return home to my grandmother, where life still felt predictable. The executive suite on the 38th floor had been vacant since morning. According to the reservation system, a senior investor would arrive within the hour. I unlocked the door, switched on the lights, and began my routine exactly as I always did. Fresh towels first. Replace the coffee capsules. Check the bathroom amenities. Straighten the curtains. The familiar sequence helped quiet my thoughts. Halfway through making the bed, I noticed a leather portfolio resting beneath the writing desk. It was unusual because lost items were almost always reported before housekeeping entered a room. I carefully picked it up, intending to deliver it to security. The clasp had not been fully closed. As I lifted it, several sheets of paper slipped onto the carpet. I knelt immediately to gather them before they became wrinkled. One page caught my attention only because I recognized the Sterling Holdings logo across the top. Beneath it sat a chart that looked remarkably similar to the one I had seen earlier inside the boardroom. But the numbers were different. Entire columns had been changed using handwritten notes in dark blue ink. One sentence circled near the bottom made my breath catch. "Transfer executive approval after revised valuation." I frowned, trying to understand what I was seeing. I had studied enough accounting in college to recognize balance sheets and financial summaries. These pages did not look like ordinary corrections. They looked like someone had rewritten the outcome before the meeting even happened. I quickly stacked the papers back together exactly as I had found them. Just as I slid them into the portfolio, I heard the electronic lock beep. My heart jumped. Someone was entering the suite. There was no time to reach the hallway. I stood beside my housekeeping cart, holding a folded towel as the door slowly opened. The first person through the entrance was the same director from earlier that day. He stopped the instant he saw me. His eyes shifted from my face to the leather portfolio resting on the desk, then back to my hands. Neither of us spoke. The silence stretched between us until he finally smiled with perfect corporate politeness. "Miss Bennett," he said softly. "What an unexpected coincidence. I hope you did not find anything in this room that does not belong to you." My pulse hammered against my ribs, but I forced myself to keep my expression calm. Years of working in luxury hotels had taught me that guests noticed panic long before they noticed confidence. I folded the towel in my hands one more time and placed it neatly on the bed before answering. "Only the housekeeping supplies, sir." The director stepped farther into the suite, quietly closing the door behind him. His tailored charcoal suit looked as perfect as it had that morning, but there was something different about him now. The polished smile remained, yet it no longer reached his eyes. He walked to the writing desk and rested one hand on the leather portfolio. "This belongs to one of our investors," he said casually. "Important documents. They have a way of confusing people who are unfamiliar with corporate finance." I nodded. "That is why I did not open it." His fingers lingered on the portfolio for another moment before lifting it from the desk. "Good. Curiosity can create unnecessary complications." The sentence sounded friendly, but something beneath it felt carefully measured. I had heard enough conversations that day to recognize when words carried more weight than they appeared to. I reached for my housekeeping cart. "If everything is satisfactory, I will finish preparing the room." Instead of leaving, he slowly walked toward the windows overlooking Central Park. "Miss Bennet, how long have you worked here?" The question sounded strangely familiar after my conversation with Nathaniel earlier that afternoon. "Almost 3 years." "Then you already understand how successful companies operate." He turned back toward me with that same controlled smile. "People stay in their own departments. Housekeeping handles rooms. Executives handle business. Life becomes much easier when everyone respects those boundaries." I understood exactly what he meant, even though he never mentioned the boardroom, the conversation I had overheard, or the papers that had slipped from the portfolio. "I always try to do my job well," I answered carefully. "I am sure you do." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a small envelope, placing it gently beside the flower arrangement on the dining table. It looked almost identical to the one Nathaniel had shown me earlier. "A gesture of appreciation for your professionalism today." I stared at it without moving. "Thank you, but I cannot accept gifts from guests." "This is not from a guest." "Then I still cannot accept it." His smile faded almost imperceptibly. "You should think about it." "I already have." The room fell silent again. He picked up the envelope without another word and slipped it back into his jacket. "Very well." He walked toward the door before pausing with his hand on the handle. "One last piece of advice, Miss Bennet. Sometimes honest people accidentally find themselves standing too close to problems they do not understand. When that happens, the wisest decision is usually to walk away." After he left, I remained perfectly still for several seconds, listening to his footsteps disappear down the hallway. Only then did I allow myself to breathe normally again. My hands were trembling so badly that I had to grip the housekeeping cart to steady them. I finished cleaning the suite as quickly as I could, checked every item twice, and finally returned to the service elevator. The moment the doors closed, I reached into my pocket and felt the smooth edge of Evelyn Brooks's business card. I remembered her exact words. "If anyone asks unusual questions, contact me before answering." Looking at the card now, I realized those questions had already begun. Without giving myself time to second-guess the decision, I stepped into the employee break room, borrowed the office telephone, and dialed the direct number printed beneath her name. Evelyn answered after the second ring. Before I could introduce myself, she spoke in a voice far more urgent than before. "Grace, do not say anything over the phone. Stay exactly where you are. Mr. Sterling has been looking for you because someone has just filed a formal report accusing you of stealing confidential company documents." The receiver almost slipped from my hand. Stealing confidential company documents. The accusation sounded so impossible that for a moment I wondered if Evelyn had called the wrong employee. "Grace," she asked after a brief silence. "Are you still there?" "Yes." My voice barely rose above a whisper. "I did not take anything." "I know," she replied immediately. "That is why I need you to stay exactly where you are. Mr. Sterling does not believe the report." Those words steadied me just enough to think clearly again. I thanked her, returned the telephone to its cradle, and sat alone in the small employee break room. The humming vending machine suddenly sounded louder than ever. Outside the narrow window, the afternoon sky had turned pale gray as clouds drifted across Manhattan. 10 minutes later the door opened. Nathaniel stepped inside without security, without assistance, and without the polished audience that usually surrounded him. Seeing the chairman standing in a room filled with plastic chairs, microwaves, and coffee stains felt almost unreal. He closed the door quietly behind him. "Miss Bennet." I stood immediately. "Sir, I never removed those documents from the room." "I know." His answer came without hesitation. "How?" He looked directly at me. "Because I reviewed the security recordings before anyone else could edit the narrative." My confusion must have shown because he continued. "The cameras clearly show the portfolio slipping from the desk while you were preparing the suite. They also show you collecting every page and placing everything back exactly where it belonged before anyone entered." I felt the tension slowly leave my shoulders. "Then why accuse me?" Nathaniel walked toward the window before answering. "Because someone expected fear to accomplish what money could not." I remembered the envelope, the careful warnings, the conversations through the connecting door. The pieces finally began fitting together. They wanted me to leave. He nodded once. "Or to become a witness nobody would consider credible." The room fell quiet. I stared at the floor, realizing just how close I had come to losing everything I had worked for. My job. My reputation. The trust my grandmother always told me was worth more than any paycheck. Nathaniel turned back toward me. "There will be another board meeting tomorrow morning." My eyes lifted in surprise. "Tomorrow?" "Yes." He folded his hands behind his back. "The directors believe they are discussing the acquisition one final time." "And they are not?" "No." His calm expression never changed. "They will be discussing honesty." I did not fully understand what he meant, but something in his voice told me he had already made a decision. "Sir," I said carefully, "I do not want anyone losing their career because of me." He looked at me for several long seconds before speaking. "This has never been about you causing harm, Grace. It has always been about people creating it." Hearing my first name again reminded me of the respect he had shown from the very beginning. He had never once referred to me as the maid. Never once spoken down to me because of my uniform. "What happens now?" I asked quietly. Nathaniel reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a small identification badge attached to a temporary blue lanyard. Across the top were the words "Executive Visitor Access." He placed it gently into my hands. "Tomorrow morning I want you sitting inside that boardroom." I stared at the badge in disbelief. "Me?" "Yes. I am only a housekeeper." "No." His voice remained calm, but carried a certainty that left no room for doubt. "Tomorrow you will simply be the one person in that room with nothing to gain from telling the truth, and right now that makes your voice more valuable than everyone else's combined." I barely slept that night. My grandmother noticed the dark circles beneath my eyes over breakfast but never pressed for answers. She simply poured another cup of coffee and smiled the same gentle smile that had carried me through every difficult season of my life. "Whatever happens today," she said, "remember that truth does not become weaker just because powerful people disagree with it." I carried those words with me as I stood outside the executive boardroom the following morning. The blue visitor badge hung around my neck where my silver housekeeping name tag usually rested. It felt unfamiliar, almost borrowed. Evelyn greeted me with a reassuring nod before opening the double doors. Every conversation inside the room stopped the moment I entered. The same polished walnut table stretched across the room. The same executives occupied the same leather chairs. The only difference was the way they looked at me. Some appeared confused. Others looked openly irritated. The director who had repeatedly challenged me leaned back in his chair with folded arms and a confident smile that suggested he believed the day would still end in his favor. Nathaniel entered a few seconds later. Without a word, everyone took their seats. He remained standing at the head of the table, resting one hand lightly against the chair in front of him. "Before we discuss today's agenda," he began, "there is another matter requiring immediate attention." His calm voice filled the room without effort. Yesterday, a formal accusation was filed claiming that confidential company documents had been stolen by a member of our hotel staff. Several directors exchanged brief glances. No one spoke. Nathaniel continued. I personally reviewed every security recording related to the incident. He pressed a button on the conference table. The large display behind him came alive. Security footage appeared on the screen, showing me gathering the scattered papers from the executive suite floor and carefully returning every page to the leather portfolio before stepping away. The recording continued until the director entered the room exactly as I remembered. Not a single document ever left the suite. Silence settled over the boardroom. It was heavier than any argument. Nathaniel paused the recording and looked around the table. Does anyone wish to explain why a false report was submitted? The director cleared his throat. Perhaps there was a misunderstanding. Nathaniel's expression never changed. Then allow us to remove any misunderstanding. Another recording appeared. This one showed the executive corridor from the previous afternoon. The same director was seen placing the leather portfolio inside the suite only minutes before I entered with my housekeeping cart. Murmurs spread around the room. Faces that had once carried complete confidence now reflected uncertainty. Nathaniel folded his hands calmly. The portfolio was intentionally left where it could be discovered. The accusation was prepared before Miss Bennet even finished cleaning the room. No one interrupted him. There is more. The final recording displayed the connecting hallway near the conference suite. Although the camera captured no audio, the timestamps matched the period when I had overheard the private discussion about altered financial reports. Nathaniel turned toward me. Miss Bennet. Every eye in the room followed his. My heartbeat quickened, but I remembered my grandmother's words and slowly stood. Nathaniel asked only one question. Did anyone ask you to change your account of what happened yesterday? I looked around the table before answering honestly. Yes. My voice remained steady. I was offered money without explanation. Then I was encouraged to forget what I had seen. Later I was warned that life becomes easier when people stay inside the boundaries assigned to them. No one laughed this time. No one reminded me that I was only the maid. The room had finally stopped seeing my uniform. For the very first time since I had walked through those doors, every person there was listening to my voice. The silence that followed my words seemed to stretch across the entire boardroom. No one reached for a coffee cup. No one glanced at a phone. The confidence that had filled the room only minutes earlier had quietly disappeared. Nathaniel allowed the silence to do what arguments never could. Finally, the director slowly rose from his chair. His expression remained controlled, but the certainty was gone. Chairman Sterling, he began, there have clearly been misunderstandings that deserve further discussion. Nathaniel looked at him without changing his calm expression. The recordings are clear. The financial documents are clear. Miss Bennet's account is consistent with the evidence. Which part remains misunderstood? The director searched the room for support. None came. Several board members who had laughed when I first entered the meeting now avoided looking in his direction altogether. One elderly woman seated near the center of the table quietly adjusted her glasses before speaking. I have served on this board for 19 years. If an employee can be falsely accused simply because she occupies a lower position, then we have failed our own standards. Another director nodded slowly. I agree. The issue is no longer the acquisition. The issue is trust. The atmosphere shifted almost visibly. People who had remained silent before were now asking careful questions about the altered reports, the misleading recommendation, and the attempt to discredit an innocent employee. Every answer only revealed another piece of the same pattern. Nathaniel never interrupted. He simply presented the verified records one by one, allowing facts to replace assumptions. When the discussion finally settled, he stood once more. Sterling Holdings has spent decades building a reputation based on integrity. That reputation was never created by buildings or balance sheets. It was created by people willing to tell the truth when it was inconvenient. He turned toward me. Yesterday, the only person in this organization who demonstrated that standard without hesitation was Miss Grace Bennet. I felt every eye return to me again, but this time their expressions had changed completely. The elderly board member stood first. She walked around the long table until she stopped directly in front of me. "Miss Bennet," she said warmly, "I owe you an apology. Yesterday I watched others dismiss you, and I said nothing. Silence can be just as unfair as unkind words. I am sorry." For a moment I did not know what to say. I simply nodded. "Thank you." One after another, several board members offered similar apologies. None of them could change what had happened, but each chose to acknowledge it instead of pretending it had never occurred. Even those who had remained silent during the first meeting now admitted they should have spoken sooner. The director who had orchestrated the accusations remained seated. He lowered his eyes without offering another explanation. Nathaniel addressed the board one final time. "Effective immediately, an independent review of the acquisition process will begin. Until that review is complete, all related approvals are suspended." No one objected. The decision passed unanimously. As the meeting came to an end, people slowly gathered their folders and laptops. Yet something remarkable happened before anyone left the room. Nathaniel remained standing beside his chair until I started walking toward the exit. Then, in full view of every executive around the table, he stepped aside and opened the boardroom door for me himself. It was a simple gesture, lasting only a few seconds, but inside that room everyone understood what it meant. The chairman of Sterling Holdings was not honoring my position. He was honoring my character. As I stepped into the hallway, I realized the greatest change had not happened inside the company records or the board vote. It had happened inside the people who had finally learned that dignity does not belong to a job title. It belongs to the person wearing it. 3 months passed more quickly than I expected. Every morning I still walked through the front entrance of the Sterling Grand Hotel before sunrise, carrying the same lunch bag and wearing the same gray housekeeping uniform. Some things had not changed at all. I still greeted the security guards by name. I still polished marble floors until they reflected the morning light. I still believed that every room deserved the same care whether it belonged to a celebrity or an ordinary family visiting New York for the first time. But other things had changed in ways I never could have imagined. People no longer looked through me as though I were part of the furniture. They looked at me and smiled. Executives who once hurried past without a glance now greeted me by name. New employee orientation included a story about integrity that everyone inside the company already knew without mentioning the details. Nobody called it the boardroom incident anymore. They simply referred to it as the day Sterling Holdings remembered who it wanted to be. Nathaniel never tried to turn that moment into publicity. There were no newspaper interviews, no speeches celebrating himself, and no photographs staged for public approval. Instead, he quietly introduced new policies protecting every employee, regardless of title, from retaliation or intimidation. Anonymous reporting systems were expanded. Leadership training focused as much on character as performance. Promotions were no longer measured only by financial results but by the way managers treated the people whose names rarely appeared in company reports. One afternoon Evelyn invited me to the executive floor again. This time I walked through the corridor without feeling like I had entered someone else's world. Nathaniel stood by the windows overlooking the city, just as he had the first day we spoke. He turned as I entered and smiled. "Grace." Hearing my name still surprised me. "You asked to see me, sir?" He handed me a simple folder. Inside was an official letter from Sterling Holdings offering full financial support to complete the business degree I had been forced to leave years earlier. The scholarship required only one condition. I had to finish what I had started. I looked up, speechless. "Why me?" Nathaniel answered without hesitation. "Because talent should never be limited by circumstance." I carefully closed the folder. "I do not know how to thank you." He shook his head gently. "You already did. I frowned slightly. How? He walked toward the window, watching the afternoon sunlight settle across the Manhattan skyline. You reminded me that leadership is not measured by how many people stand when you enter a room. It is measured by whether the quietest person feels safe enough to speak while you are there. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. The city below continued moving exactly as it always had, filled with millions of people carrying stories no balance sheet could ever measure. As I prepared to leave, Nathaniel opened the office door before I reached it. Good luck with school, Grace. I smiled. Thank you. One more thing. I turned back. Never let anyone convince you that your worth depends on the uniform you are wearing. I carried those words with me long after I left his office. Today my business degree hangs on the wall beside a photograph of my grandmother, who lived long enough to watch me graduate. I eventually accepted a leadership role within the company, but I kept the silver housekeeping name tag from my very first uniform in the top drawer of my desk. Whenever I look at it, I remember that the most important door I ever opened was not the one leading into a boardroom. It was the one that taught an entire company, and perhaps even its chairman, that respect is never earned by power alone. It is earned the moment we choose to see the humanity in someone everyone else overlooked.